Dear people watching and listening, Assalamu alaikum. Kindly like and share this video and subscribe to my YouTube channel. Please support my channel by contributing to my Patreon account so that I can continue making the audiobook series. Salah ad-Deen al-Ayyubi, Volume 3, The Battle of Hattin, the Conquest of Jerusalem, and the Third Crusade. Start of Part 5 of Chapter 3. After Acre. The fall of Acre had a great effect on the Muslims. Even though it was not a knockout blow as such, this event weakened the Muslims greatly to such an extent that after that they resorted to passive resistance, one of the manifestations of which was their destruction of some citadels and castles, so that they would not fall into enemy hands and then be turned into bases for attacking Muslim regions. It is true that the failure of Salah ad-Deen's army in the siege of Tyre is regarded as the beginning of decline for the Muslims, but this failure may ultimately be classified under the heading of failures of Salah ad-Deen's army, not under the heading of Crusader victories. What that means is that what happened in Tyre was that the Muslims were unable to besiege one city. As for Acre, the defenders of the city were defeated and the Crusaders were victorious. The Battle of Arsuf. Richard the Lion-Hearted set out a plan to regain control over the cities on the coast of Palestine from Acre to Ascalon before heading to the interior to take back Jerusalem. He left Acre on Thursday the 29th of Rajab, 587 Hijri, that is 22 August 1191 Common Era, at the head of the Crusader army, taking the coastal route where the right flank would be protected and supplied by the Crusader fleet. The journey was not easy. The Crusaders suffered from the intense heat and lack of provisions. The cities and villages through which they passed were already devastated, and thus could not provide them with any sustenance, and the Muslims harassed their rear guard. In fact, Salah ad-Deen did not want to let the Crusader army march in peace. He set out after them, for he was afraid that Richard the Lion-Hearted would move towards Ascalon and occupy it, using it as a base from which to cut off the communication lines between him and Jerusalem and Egypt, which had been providing him with a striking force. After the Crusaders captured Haifa, which had been abandoned by its Muslim garrison, they resumed their march towards Caesarea. When they drew close to it on 7 Shaban, that is 30th August, it looked as if an engagement between the two armies was about to take place. The Muslims had the advantage of free movement at a time when the Crusaders had cornered themselves between the Muslims and the sea. Intense fighting was about to break out any day, and Salah ad-Deen tried to draw the Crusaders into the interior so that they would drift away from their route parallel to the coast and thus lose the advantage of the support of the fleet. But Richard the Lion-Hearted, who is regarded as a military genius, did not fall into Salah ad-Deen's trap. He continued on his course and he called his men to stay in order and not be diverted by Muslim provocation, thus causing Salah ad-Deen to lose the opportunity that he was always hoping for. The Crusaders captured Caesarea, which lay in ruins after the Muslims had destroyed it, so they did not benefit from it in terms of provisions or money. Then they continued their march until they reached the outskirts of Arsuf. There they moved towards the forest that lies to the northeast of the city, 2 miles from the sea, where the plain was wide and open enough for two armies to engage. Salah ad-Deen, who had reached the forest before the enemy, decided to confront them in this place. So he mobilized his forces to prepare for a confrontation. When Richard the Lion-Hearted realized what his plan was, he did two things. He sent word requesting help from the crusaders in Acre, and he tried to settle matters with Salah ad-Deen by peaceful means. It is most likely that Salah ad-Deen wanted to win time until the Turkmen forces that he had requested could arrive, so he pretended to accept the offer of negotiation and delegated his brother Al-Adil to negotiate on his behalf. The latter met with Richard the Lion-Hearted on the 12th of Shaban, that is 5th of September, but the negotiations foundered because of the stubborn attitude of Richard the Lion-Hearted, as he insisted that the Muslims give up the places they had conquered in the kingdom of Jerusalem. Al-Adil immediately halted the negotiations, and the two parties had no option left but to fight. In the meantime, military help reached both sides and they prepared to fight. The battle began on the morning of Saturday, 14 Shaban 587 Hijri, that is 7 September 1191 Common Era. In the beginning, the Muslim horsemen surrounded the crusaders and nearly finished them off, but Richard the Lion-Hearted stood firm and quickly reorganized his troops. The balance tipped in his favor, and the Muslim ranks soon started to collapse. When Salah ad-Deen saw what had befallen the Muslims, he shouted to them and urged them to fight in jihad for the sake of Allah. He himself stood firm in the battle, and when the people saw his courage and patience, they rallied around him and fought the crusaders heroically until they were able to defeat them and force them to retreat to their original positions. Destruction of Ascalon. After the Battle of Arsuf, Richard headed towards Jaffa and seized it without any resistance, because there were no Muslims there to defend it according to Ibn al-Athir, and he began to rebuild its fortifications. As for Salah ad-Deen, he headed towards Ramlah where he held a council of war, consulting his general staff as to what he should do. The Amir Alam ad-Din Sulaiman ibn Jundur suggested that he should evacuate Ascalon and then destroy it, because the enemy's target after Acre and Jaffa was Ascalon and then Jerusalem, and because Jaffa, where Richard had camped, was located between Jerusalem and Ascalon, and there was no way to protect both cities at the same time. The emirs who were calling for the destruction of Ascalon stated that defending the city would require a large garrison to be posted there, numbering some 30,000 fighters, or at least 20,000. They said to Salah ad-Deen, "You have seen what happened to us yesterday. If the Franks come to Ascalon and we confront them, we can divert them from it. Then they will undoubtedly fight us in order to expel us from it and take over the city. If that happens, we will be in the same situation as at Acre, and it will be even worse for us, because the enemy has become stronger by capturing Acre and the weapons and other supplies in it, and we have grown weaker because of what we have lost." Salah ad-Deen objected to this opinion and asked some of his commanders to enter Ascalon and organize its defenses, but they refused and replied to him in a harsh and rough manner that was not their usual way. However, this behavior became their habit from then onwards, as is apparent from the reports of al-Isfahani and Ibn al-Athir, according to whom they told him, "If you want to protect it, that is Ascalon, then you should enter it with us or send one of your older sons. Otherwise none of us will enter it lest there happen to us what happened to the people of Acre." Salah ad-Deen was unable to convince the emirs, Hence he was very saddened, and he stayed up all night worrying. Ibn Shaddad reported that the Sultan only slept a little that night, and he called me to meet with him before dawn. So I came, and he brought his son al-Malik al-Afdal, and consulted him about the matter. Then he said, "By Allah, if I were to lose all my children, that would be dearer to me than knocking down a single stone of Ascalon. But if Allah has decreed that, and it could serve the interests of the Muslims, what can I do?" Finally, he was forced to accept the suggestion of his commanders, and he agreed to destroy it. They ordered the governor of the city to take charge of that himself. The governor wielded the pickaxe to destroy the city at dawn on the 19th of Shaban, 587 Hijri, that is 12th of September 1191 Common Era. Then he mobilized the people, dividing the wall of the city among them by assigning each group with its leader a part of the wall, and he and his son took part in destroying it. He sent word to his brother Al-Adil, who was staying in the city of Yabna near Ramlah and Jaffa, asking him to prolong the peace talks in the hopes that he would be able to finish destroying the city. The people were very upset at what they were doing, and began to mourn and weep, because Ascalon was a very beautiful city, and was very dear to them. Its walls were well fortified, and it was well built, and people so liked to live there that it was called the Bride of Syria, because of its beauty. After its demolition was complete, he ordered that the ruins be set on fire. Its inhabitants left it and dispersed into Egypt and Syria. The process of demolishing and burning it lasted until the beginning of Ramadan 587 Hijri, that is the end of September 1191 Common Era. After the destruction of Ascalon was complete, Yabna became the headquarters of Al-Adil, but he went to Ramlah. As for Richard, he was very busy establishing fortifications in Jaffa, and he did not take the risk of attacking Jerusalem, because if he were to set out towards that city, there was a strong possibility that Salah ad-Deen's army could cut off communications between him and the sea. So it was wise and rational to make sure of the fortifications of Jaffa before starting any further adventures, because loss would be more painful to the Crusaders' reputation if they captured the city, and were then forced to leave it again. Despite that, the delay clearly became too lengthy, and gave Salah ad-Din the opportunity to reinforce his means of defending the holy city, and reorganizing his army in preparation for the next round at the time when the Crusaders were enjoying themselves and relaxing in Jaffa. Richard's concern for renovating and fortifying Jaffa was no less than Salah ad-Din's concern for destroying Ascalon, because the Crusader leader realized that it was impossible to take Jerusalem without consolidating his control of Jaffa, especially now that Ascalon had been destroyed. Organization of the defenses of Jerusalem. Salah ad-Din did not return to Jerusalem until later on, at the end of Zulqa'dah 587 Hijri, but he sent al-Malik al-Adil to it to check on it and see to its fortifications. He preferred to stay in the area close to it which the army had destroyed, such as the vicinity of Ramlah. His intention by doing so was to be close to the enemy and to Jerusalem at the same time, so that if the enemy thought of attacking Jerusalem, he could stop them and confront them in open battle. On the 6th of Shawwal, Salah ad-Din gathered his senior amirs and commanders and consulted them as to what he should do if the enemy set out, as many reports about them showed that they had agreed to set out towards the Muslim camp. It was unanimously agreed that they should stay where they were, and if the Franks came out they would meet them. In fact, two of the crusaders who had been granted safety came to his camp and told him that the enemy had decided to set out the day after next. Then one of the Muslims, who had been a prisoner of the crusaders and had escaped from captivity, arrived and told them that the enemy was intending to set out. At that point, Salah ad-Deen began to fortify Jerusalem, and he sent word to different cities asking for men to do these tasks. And the Sultan and his sons and emirs also worked on it, along with the Qadis and scholars. A large group, estimated at 50 Hijazi men, arrived from Mosul for the purpose of cutting stones to strengthen the walls and ditches of Jerusalem. When this work was completed, a caller was ordered to announce to the troops in the camp to get ready and set up the banners to confront the enemy. At this point, the Ayyubid army suffered a terrible setback with the death of the most prominent of its commanders, namely Taqi ad-Din Umar in Mesopotamia. The Sultan grieved deeply, but he concealed the news from the troops so that this news would not reach the enemy at that critical moment. The brave commander and Amir Hussam Muhammad ibn Umar ibn Lajin, the nephew of Salah ad-Din, also died at the age of 19 of a sickness that had befallen him, on the same day that Taqi ad-Din Umar died. That was 19 Ramadan 587 Hijri, in the autumn of 1191 Common Era. It is possible that news of the Ayyubid army's preparations reached Richard, but he did not want to meet them on the battlefield. Furthermore, the king maintained his insistence that the principle of negotiations should form the basis of the relationship between the two sides, as the events of the following days showed. As soon as winter 587 Hijri, that is 1191 Common Era, began, the two sides halted preparations and no confrontation or meeting on the battlefield occurred between them. When the rain became very heavy, Salah ad-Din went to Jerusalem, and the crusaders returned to Jaffa. Some of them went to Acre. Richard continued sending envoys to Salah ad-Din, urging him to make peace. We find that Salah ad-Din was not very enthusiastic about a peace deal, but he wanted to benefit from the atmosphere of negotiation during the season in which his emir's armies had returned to their homelands. Hence he asked al-Malik al-Adil once again to stall Richard until the troops had come back from the provinces. Al-Malik al-Adil left Jerusalem at the beginning of Rabiul Awwal, 588 Hijri, that is March 1192 Common Era, but the negotiations did not lead anywhere, whereupon some groups of crusaders occupied some cities and fortresses whose defenses were weak, such as Ascalon, which Richard had rebuilt and made into the strongest citadel on the entire Palestinian coast. They took over the fortress of Darum, which Salah ad-Din had previously ordered to be destroyed, and when Richard took it over he punished its defenders severely. They also occupied fortresses and other minor sites along with the Palestinian coast. Negotiations between Al-Adil and Richard. The negotiations began on 18 Shawwal 588 Hijri, that is 9th November 1192 Common Era, when Richard the Lion-Hearted sent a message to Salah ad-Din from his camp near Bazur, asking him to enter into negotiations to reach an agreement because fighting had destroyed many of the forces on both sides and ruined the land. These negotiations, which Salah ad-Din delegated to his brother Al-Adil, soon faltered. However, because of Richard the Lion-Hearted's insistence on taking Jerusalem and the region west of the Jordan with all its fortresses, in addition to holding on to Ascalon, and he wanted the return of the true cross. All of these conditions were rejected by Salah ad-Deen. So a few days later the lion-hearted proposed new terms, as follows. 1. Al-Malik al-Adil, the brother of Salah ad-Deen, was to marry the Princess Jonah, the sister of Richard the Lion-Hearted, and widow of the King of Sicily. 2. Salah ad-Deen would give to his brother everything that was under his control in Palestine, and Richard the Lion-Hearted would give his sister all the cities of the coast that were under his control, including Ascalon. 3. The couple would live in Jerusalem, and the Christians would be able to come and visit the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. 4. The Christians would regain possession of the true cross. 5. Prisoners would be released by both sides. And 6. Some villages in Palestine would be given back to the Templars and Hospitallers, but not the fortresses. Al-Adil welcomed this offer and thought that it was a good idea, and perhaps he aimed to unite the Muslims and crusaders in Syria under his rule, and bring about peace in that and on the basis of ties of love and marriage between the two sides. Salah ad-Din thought that this offer was some kind of joke, but he pretended to be happy to agree to it. It seems that his acceptance of this venture was because he believed that the King of England would never be able to carry out this plan, and that this was a mockery and plot on his part. It quickly became apparent that the obstacle that prevented implementation of this plan came from Jonah herself, who was alarmed to hear of this deal, and said that there was nothing that would make her marry a Muslim man, which prompted Richard the Lion-Hearted to ask Al-Adil to convert to Christianity, in order to overcome this obstacle, but Al-Adil refused. Actually, the fact that these three statesmen accepted this plan only indicates that they were becoming closer politically and culturally in Syria, a century after the Crusades began, in addition to the spirit of tolerance, which had clearly begun to grow in the attitude and behavior of both parties. This is indicated by the fact that King Richard the Lion-Hearted met with Al-Adil at a splendid feast that was held on 18 Shawwal 588 Hijri. Then they parted after the bond of friendship had become strong between them. The English king expressed his desire to meet Salah ad-Din, but Al-Adil refused his request and said, "If kings meet, there will be a greater enmity between them after that, but if they reach a peace deal beforehand, then the meeting will be good." From then on, Richard the Lion-Hearted became preoccupied with solving the Crusaders' problems, especially the fierce dispute between Conrad de Montferrat and Guy de Lusignan. Salah ad-Din's political acumen and attitude towards the war. At the time when negotiations were ongoing with Richard the Lion-Hearted, Salah ad-Din received Renaud of Sidon as an envoy from Conrad de Montferrat, who offered him an alliance in return for the acquisition of Sidon and Beirut. He even suggested that Acre should be given back to the Muslims. He was aiming to divert the course of negotiations towards his own interests. When Richard the Lion-Hearted found out about the actions of Conrad de Montferrat, he did his utmost to bring him back to the Crusader ranks, but his efforts met with failure and Conrad de Montferrat renewed his attempts to reach an understanding with Salah ad-Din. Salah ad-Din held a meeting with his general staff to decide with which of the two Crusader parties he should continue negotiations. Al-Malik al-Adil and some of the emirs were inclined to continue negotiations with the English king because he was going to leave the East, whereas Conrad de Montferrat was intending to stay and settle in Palestine, so he decided to accept the suggestions of Richard the Lion-Hearted in principle. Whatever the case concerning the attempts to reach a deal between the Muslims and the Crusaders, and what happened during that period of fighting between them, although it was limited, there was no reason for trying to draw close. In the meantime, bad news reached Richard the Lion-Hearted from the west. His brother John had revolted against him, which meant that he had to return to his homeland quickly. Nonetheless, he did not want to leave the East before solving the internal problems of the Crusaders and reaching an understanding with the Muslims. As for the internal problems, they were solved with the assassination of Conrad de Montferrat by the assassins on the 13th Rabiul Thani, 588 Hijri, that is 28 April 1192 Common Era. Richard the Lion-Hearted got rid of a stubborn opponent and gained authority over Tyre, and Henry de Champagne chose what was offered to him of the kingdom of Jerusalem after marrying Isabella, the widow of Conrad and heiress to the throne of the kingdom. As for Richard's problems with the Muslim side, they required a different kind of solution, based on strength. He hoped to recapture Jerusalem, and he captured the citadel of At-Tarum on 9 Jamadiul Awwal, that is 23rd May, after resistance on the part of the garrison, but he failed to capture Battle of Jaffa, so he headed towards Ascalon, from which he set out towards Jerusalem, and he arrived in Beit Nuba on 27 Jamadiul Awwal, that is 11th June. Salah ad-Deen for his part prepared to resist him and headed towards Jerusalem. Salah ad-Deen's preparations to defend Jerusalem. Salah ad-Deen instantly made arrangements to defend the holy city, including the following. 1. He divided its walls among his commanders and equipped them with what they needed to defend them. 2. He sabotaged the water sources surrounding the city, so that there would be nothing left to drink around Jerusalem at all, which would make the enemy very thirsty if they tried to attack it. 3. He summoned the forces from other regions, so al-Malik al-Afdal came with the eastern troops, Badr ad-Din Daldarim al-Yaruqi came with the Turkmen troops, and Izz-ad-Din ibn al-Muqaddim came too. And 4. The Muslim horsemen launched swift and sudden raids against the Crusader camp. Salah ad-Din held a meeting in Jerusalem on 19th Jamadiul Thani, that is the beginning of July, with his general staff to consult them about the best way of defending the city against the Crusader hordes. The Sultan asked Al-Qadi ibn Shaddad to open the meeting, so he began by speaking of the virtues of jihad and called upon them to follow the example of the noble messenger. They were all pleased with his words, then they fell silent, and it was as if you could hear a pin drop. After a short while, Salah ad-Din began to speak. He told them, "The blood of the Muslims and their wealth and their children are your responsibility. No one among the Muslims can stand up to this enemy except you. If you turn your horses around and flee, the enemy will roll up these lands like a scroll, and you will be to blame. You are the ones who took on this responsibility, and you have consumed the wealth of the state treasury. The Muslims of all lands are depending on you. Wassalam." The Amir Saif ad-Din al-Mashtub answered him, saying, "Your Highness, we are your Mamluks and slaves, and you are the one who bestowed upon us, made us great, gave to us and made us independent of means. We have nothing but our souls, and they are in your hands. By Allah, not one of us will ever stop supporting you until he dies." The others agreed with what al-Mashtub said. The Sultan was happy with that, but the emirs quickly retracted their statements the following day, according to Abu Hayja. They declared that it would be a mistake to corner themselves inside Jerusalem, because they were afraid that the same thing would happen to them as had happened to the people of Acre, and they thought that they should meet them outside the walls of Jerusalem. They said, "If Allah decrees that we should defeat them, we will take over the rest of their lands, and if it is otherwise, meaning defeat, then the troops will be safe even if Jerusalem falls." Salah ad-Deen was not convinced by the emir's answer, because Jerusalem was very important to him, a responsibility so great that even mountains could not bear it. Indeed, they replied to him in the harsh manner that they had been using for some time, as we mentioned above. It seems that the conflict between elements of his troops and his commanders, who were Kurds and Turkmen, had become stronger and reached a serious level. That was apparent in their words when they said, "If you want us to do that, then you or one of your family should be with us inside Jerusalem, so that we can rally behind him. Otherwise the Kurds will not submit to the Turks, and the Turks will not submit to the Kurds." In fact, Salah ad-Din found himself in an unenviable position. Ibn Shaddad clearly sensed the helplessness of the situation when he asked him to delegate his affairs to Allah and to acknowledge his helplessness before him with regard to what he was facing, and asked Allah to respond to his prayer. The historian saw him when he was praying, with tears falling onto his prayer mat when he prostrated, and he spent Friday weighed down with worry. Then his intelligence agents came and told him that the crusaders had decided to halt their march towards Jerusalem. Ibn al-Latif says that Richard asked the old crusaders, the Syrian Franks, to describe to him the location of the city of Jerusalem and its fortifications that Salah ad-Din had built around it. So they described to him everything that he asked about. When he had got a precise idea about the location of the city, he said, "This is a city that cannot be besieged so long as Salah ad-Din is still alive and the Muslims are united." This attitude caused a split among the crusaders, as some wanted to attack Jerusalem, whilst others called for a halt. Richard was with the latter group, whereas the French were with the former group, when they said, "We have only come from our homelands because of Jerusalem, and we will not go back without capturing it." Richard replied to them, "The water in this place has been spoiled, and there is no water left around it at all, so from whence shall we drink?" They said, "We will drink the water of Nuku, which was located a league from Jerusalem, and we will be content to drink once a day." The Crusaders decided to put the matter to a vote and let the majority rule, and it was decided to stop the attack, so they moved on towards Ramlah. The Sultan was very relieved about that. The Battle of Jaffa. The Battle of Jaffa is regarded as the last serious armed confrontation between the Muslims and the Third Crusade. Richard the Lion-Hearted had used this city as his base after his victory over Salah ad-Din at Arsuf, because of its proximity to Jerusalem. Whilst negotiations were ongoing between the two sides, Muslim and Crusader, with regard to a peace deal, Richard the Lion-Hearted left Jaffa for Acre, having made plans to set sail for his homeland if a deal was not signed with the Muslims. According to this plan, he would march towards Beirut and then set sail from there to Europe. This action gave Salah ad-Din an opportunity, and he made the most of it to organize a campaign against Jaffa. It is possible that he was aiming to achieve 4 goals. 1. He wanted to capture Jaffa in the absence of the English king. 2. He hoped to achieve a decisive victory over the Crusaders in Jaffa. 3. He was attempting to raise the morale of his troops. And 4. He wanted to prevent Richard the Lion-Hearted from occupying Beirut. As soon as Salah ad-Deen approached Jaffa on 15 Rajab 588 Hijri, that is 27 July 1192 Common Era, an urgent message was sent to Richard the Lion-Hearted, bringing him the news of the attack on Jaffa. He hastened to defend it and save it. He decided to approach it by sea, supported by the Pisans and the Genoans, as well as sending an army by land. The winds were against him, however, and he was detained at the head of Mount Carmel. His land army did not want to reach Jaffa before their king arrived, so they slowed down their march. These military developments gave the Muslims a good opportunity to liberate Jaffa, and in fact they entered the city on Friday 18th Rajab, that is 30th July, after bitter fighting with its garrison and laying siege to its citadel, so the Crusaders were forced to seek a peace deal. At the time appointed for the handover of the citadel to the Muslims, Richard the Lion-Hearted landed and launched a counterattack. He managed to enter the city and force the Muslims out, and Salah ad-Deen withdrew his army from the city. Richard's illness had gotten worse, however, and he sent messengers repeatedly to Salah ad-Deen, asking him for fruits and ice. His sickness also made him crave pears and plums, and Salah ad-Deen, with his tolerant attitude, supplied him with these. Richard the Lion-Hearted renewed his offer of a peace deal to Salah ad-Deen, motivated by several factors. 1. He was suffering from a worsening sickness, and his health had deteriorated noticeably to the point that he was unable to lead his forces and plan soundly. 2. He had received disturbing news from England that his brother John was up to no good, which meant that he had to return quickly. 3. Military support from Europe was cut off. 4. He despaired of taking back Jerusalem. And 5. The Crusaders were beset by exhaustion, and his nephew Henry and other religious and military groups demonstrated their lack of confidence in his policies. Salah ad-Deen indicated the reasons that prompted him to accept the peace deal, which included: 1. There was ongoing conflict between the Kurds and the Turks in his army. 2. The troops were fed up and were showing open defiance. 3. The enemy's strength had increased. And 4. He feared a dispute within his family after his death, and that they would neglect the public interest. Negotiations and the Treaty of Ramlah. The negotiations with the Franks continued for 15 months, and it took 42 delegations and much starting and stopping of negotiations. The one who always initiated it was the King of England, Richard. The negotiations passed through 6 distinct stages before they were crowned with the peace deal. The first stage. Only 10 days after the arrival of King Richard, he hastened to send an envoy to Salah ad-Deen. The envoy was permitted to go to Al-Malik al-Adil first, who then brought him to Salah ad-Deen. The message that Richard sent may be summed up as follows. The English king was asking to meet with Salah ad-Deen. When Salah ad-Deen learned of that, he responded without hesitation. Kings do not meet until after they have made a truce. As Richard wanted to meet Salah ad-Deen, it was essential to agree upon a truce before meeting, and it was essential to have an interpreter who was trusted by both sides, who could understand what each side was saying. If a truce was agreed upon, he would meet the English king. The envoy went back to Richard, and returned a second time to speak with al-Malik al-Adil. The matter ended with an agreement that al-Adil would meet King Richard in Murjaka, with the troops around them and accompanied by an interpreter. The envoy returned, but he was delayed for a few days because of illness. It is most likely that Richard was the one who was sick, not the envoy. According to another report, the Crusader leaders rejected the idea of a peace treaty with the Muslims, saying that it posed a risk to Christianity. The envoy came back again and apologized for the delay because of sickness. Among the things that the envoy said was that kings, when they become close to one another, exchange gifts, and he added, "I have something that is befitting for the Sultan, and I shall ask for permission to deliver it." Al-Malik al-Adil agreed to that on condition that a gift would be sent in return to the English king. The envoy accepted that and said, "The gift is some eagles brought from across the sea. They have grown weak, so it would be good if you offered us some birds and chickens, so that we may feed them to them and they will become stronger, and we will bring them to you." Al-Malik al-Adil joked with him, saying, "The king needs some fowl and chicken, and he wants to take it from us with this excuse." The talks stopped for a number of days. Then the envoy came back, accompanied by a Muslim Maghribi man who had been captured and held by the Crusaders for a long time. This man was a gift to the Sultan, who accepted that and set him free, and sent the envoy back honored. The historian Ibn Shaddad summed up the real reasons that lay behind the exchange of envoys, saying, "The Crusaders' aim in sending these messages repeatedly was to find out how strong the morale and resolve of the Muslims were, and the aim of the Muslims in receiving these envoys was to find out the same about the Crusaders." The second stage. On 9th Jamadi-ul-Sani, 587 Hijri, that is 4th July 1191 Common Era, during the fighting between the Muslims and the Crusaders in Acre, when the Muslim garrison decided to give up fighting and sent word to Richard, he rejected the offer from the garrison of the city. But on the same day he sent 3 envoys to Salah ad-Deen, asking for fruits and ice. The envoy stated that the Hospitaller Grand Master Gamir de Nablus was coming the next day to talk about a peace deal. Salah ad-Deen honored the envoys and admitted them to the marketplace of the camp, which they saw. They returned on the same day to their own camp. That was followed by the surrender of the city of Acre to the Crusaders, and Salah ad-Deen's reception of the Crusader envoys concerning the handover of Acre. This aspect has to do with the city of Acre only. We have explained above that this incident did not affect the foundation of the general peace deal that we are discussing here. The third stage. The third stage of negotiations took place prior to the Battle of Arsuf in 11 Shaban 587 Hijri, that is 3rd September 1191 Common Era. Some Crusader envoys came, asking to speak to al-Malik al-Adil, and they were allowed to do so. In essence, what the envoy said was that the fighting has gone on for too long, and too many men and heroes had been killed on both sides. They had come only to support the Franks of the coast, so if Salah ad-Deen were to make a peace deal with them, each party would go back whence it had come. Salah ad-Deen realized the implications of what these envoys proposed, So he wrote to his brother Al-Adil asking him to prolong the talks with the envoys until Muslim reinforcements came. On the following day, Al-Malik al-Adil met with the English King Richard, and Humphrey of Torun acted as interpreter. Al-Adil asked Richard about his conditions for the peace treaty. Richard replied, "All the land should return to us, and you should go back to your country." What he meant was that things should go back to the way they were before the Battle of Hattin. Al-Malik al-Adil did not accept these conditions, and he spoke harshly to the English king in response. An argument took place that led to the English king and his entourage departing. Subsequently, the Battle of Arsuf took place in which the Crusaders were victorious, even though it was not decisive. 8 days later, whilst the Crusader forces under the leadership of Richard were in the city of Jaffa, and Salah ad-Deen was in the process of destroying the city of Ascalon, on 19 Shaban 587 Hijri, that is 11 September 1191 Common Era, a messenger came to Salah ad-Deen from Al-Malik al-Adil, telling him that the Crusaders were talking about a peace deal, and that their conditions included the return of all the coastal land. Salah ad-Deen asked his brother al-Adil to reopen negotiations, because he could see that the Muslims were tired and fed up with fighting. He also asked him again to prolong the negotiations, so that he could complete the demolition of Ascalon. During the following days there occurred an incident which had implications for the history of the Third Crusade. In 12 Ramadan 587 Hijri, that is 3rd October 1191 Common Era, envoys arrived from Conrad de Montferrat, the Marquis. Conrad sensed that the Crusaders wanted to capture Tyre, so he split from the troops of the Third Crusade and sent word to Salah ad-Deen asking for a peace deal. He offered a cessation of hostilities, in return for which Salah ad-Deen would cede Sidon and Beirut to him. Conrad in his turn would show open hostility towards Richard, and with his own forces he promised to besiege and capture Acre. It was known that Conrad was crafty and envious. Hence Salah ad-Deen wanted to know if his intentions were good, so he asked him initially to lay siege to Acre and capture it, and to release the Muslim prisoners in Acre and Tyre. Only after that would Salah ad-Deen hand over Sidon and Beirut. Later that same day, the envoys of King Richard arrived to talk again about the issue of a peace deal. Richard had heard about the envoy sent by Conrad de Montferrat to Salah ad-Deen, so he returned to Acre to try to cancel the idea of a peace deal that Conrad had initiated, and also to win Conrad back to the Crusader ranks. No doubt what happened made Salah ad-Deen realize the extent of the division between the local Crusaders and the forces of the Third Crusade. Richard also realized that what had happened on Conrad's part was to be regarded as a blow against him and the forces of the Third Crusade, which had suffered and gone through a great deal to defend the local Crusaders. All of that had the greatest impact on the course of negotiations and the conditions stipulated in the following stages. The fourth stage. On 24 Ramadan 587 Hijri, that is 15th of October 1191 Common Era, an envoy arrived from the English King Richard, bringing a horse as a gift to Al-Malik al-Adil in return for a gift that Al-Malik al-Adil had sent to him. This was the beginning of the negotiations of the fourth stage. 2 days later, Richard sent word asking Al-Malik al-Adil to send his envoy to talk to him with regard to a peace deal. Al-Adil responded to his request and sent his envoy to meet King Richard. The king said, The Muslims and the Franks are exhausted. The country is ruined and is no longer under the authority of either of the two parties. Property and lives have been destroyed on both sides. This matter has run its course, and now there is no talk about anything except Jerusalem, the cross, and the cities. Jerusalem is our place of worship, and we will never give it up, even if not one of us is left. As for the other cities, whatever is beyond the river Jordan should be returned to us. As for the cross, it is wood that has no value to you, but to us it is of great importance. So the Sultan should do us a favor and return it to us. Then we will bring about peace and be relieved from these ongoing troubles. When Al-Malik al-Adil heard of what Richard was asking for, he in turn conveyed it to Salah ad-Deen, who said in response to the English king, "Jerusalem is the same for us as it is for you. It is more important for us than it is for you, for it is the place to which our Prophet ﷺ was taken on his night journey, and it is the meeting place of the angels. It cannot be imagined that we would give it up, and we cannot even utter such words among the Muslims. As for the other cities, they are also originally ours, and your capture of them is something that happened later, because of the weak state in which the Muslims were at that time. As for the cross, destroying it is a great act of worship for us, and it is not permissible for us to give it away for nothing, except for a purpose which serves the interests of Islam and outweighs that." 3 days later, the envoy of King Richard came back from Jaffa with a new suggestion, which may be summed up as the idea that Al-Malik al-Adil should marry King Richard's sister Jonah, the former queen of Sicily, and the capital of their kingdom should be Jerusalem. Richard would give her the coastal lands that he had conquered from Acre to Jaffa, Ascalon, and so on, and he would make her queen of the coast. Salah ad-Deen, for his part, was to give his brother Al-Adil all the lands of the coast, and make that his possession, in addition to whatever other lands and fiefs Al-Adil already possessed. He was also to hand over to him the true cross. The villages and fortresses would belong to the Templars and Hospitallers. Prisoners would be released on both sides, and the King of England would return to his homeland. When Salah ad-Deen heard the suggestions of the English king, he hastened to agree, believing that Richard would not agree to it. This was a trick and plot on his part, in other words, a kind of joke. When Jonah heard of her brother's suggestion that she should marry Al-Malik al-Adil, a Muslim, she got angry and swore the most solemn vow that she would never do that. Hence Richard suggested that Al-Adil should convert to Christianity. Al-Adil refused to agree to that, but he left the door to further negotiations open. The fifth stage. During the fifth stage, there were twofold parallel negotiations. The first line had to do with the negotiations with the envoys of Conrad de Montferrat, and the second line had to do with the negotiations with the English King Richard. This stage began on the 15th Shawwal 587 Hijri, that is 5th November 1191 Common Era, when Reynaud Grenier of Sidon arrived as an envoy from Conrad. It may be understood from the historical texts that the negotiations with Conrad had not stopped. The Muslims received him warmly and hosted him until arrangements were made for him to meet Salah ad-Deen. After 4 days, Salah ad-Deen met Reynaud Grenier and showed him great honor and hospitality. The Islamic sources describe Conrad de Montferrat as one of the toughest of the crusaders and one of the most experienced in war, a man of deep insight who knew how to plan. Conrad's offer may be summed up as follows. The Muslims were to give up Sidon to him. In return, he would make an alliance with the Muslims against the forces of the Third Crusade and declare enmity towards them. Salah ad-Deen listened to the suggestions from the envoy and promised him that he would give his response later on. On the same day that Salah ad-Deen met the envoy of Conrad, in the evening Humphrey of Toron arrived as the envoy of the English King Richard. Salah ad-Deen met him and the Crusader envoy presented his suggestions. It may be noted that the war was still ongoing during these negotiations. In 4 Rabiul Awwal 588 Hijri, that is 20th March 1192 Common Era, Al-Adil set out from Jerusalem with a specific offer for a peace deal, which would allow the Crusaders to take control of Beirut if they insisted on their demands, on the condition that it should remain in ruins and not be rebuilt. The true cross would be handed over to them. A Frankish priest would be appointed in charge of the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, and the gates of Jerusalem would be open to the Crusaders to visit, on condition that they did not carry arms. The motive for these new suggestions was that the Muslims were suffering from exhaustion due to the ongoing campaigns, a heavy burden of debt, and being far away from their homelands. King Richard's desire for a peace deal and to go back to his homeland only increased when an envoy reached his camp from England, telling him that Prince John, the brother of King Richard, was trying to seize power and gain control of England, and asked him in the name of the senior minister of England to return to his kingdom. This news worried Richard. In addition to that, around 20th March 1192 Common Era, that is 4th Rabiul Awwal 588 Hijri, Hugh the Duke of Burgundy, who was the commander of the remnants of the French forces, summoned them back from Richard's camp because the king was not supplying these forces with the equipment necessary for fighting. The following month, Conrad de Montferrat was assassinated, as we have explained previously. Thus another stage of negotiations began, in different circumstances than those of previous stages. Conrad had disappeared from the Crusader political stage, and the situation in England had become critical. The English king had to end the war and go back to his own country. The sixth stage. The sixth and final stage of the negotiations was lengthy and complicated, and lasted nearly 5 months. On the 22nd Shaban 588 Hijri, that is 2nd September 1192 Common Era, Salah ad-Deen's envoys brought their final offer, which was then signed by Richard the Lion-Hearted. These envoys also wrote their names beside his as witnesses to the treaty, which stated the following. 1. The Crusaders would have the coastal cities from Tyre in the north to Jaffa in the south, and including Caesarea, Haifa and Arsuf. 2. Ascalon would revert to Muslim control, provided that it was demolished. 3. The Muslims and Crusaders would divide Lod and Ramlah each evenly between them. 4. The Christians would have the right to visit Jerusalem freely. 5. Both Muslims and Christians would have the right to pass through the land of the other party. And 6. This treaty was to last for 3 years and 3 months. Salah ad-Deen stipulated that the land of the assassins should be included in the treaty, meaning that the regions controlled by them were to be regarded as part of the Muslim territory that was included in the treaty. In return, Richard the Lion-Hearted stipulated that the principalities of both Antioch and Tripoli were to be included. When the truce was concluded, Salah ad-Deen gave the crusaders permission to visit Jerusalem. The Muslim troops mixed with the crusader troops, and a group of Muslims went to Jaffa seeking trade, whilst many crusaders came to Jerusalem on pilgrimage. Salah ad-Din sent guards to protect them, and his aim in doing so was to let them enjoy their visit and then go back to their country. End of part 5 of chapter 3.